Over the next weeks and months, I want to help you in your journey to discover the Greek language, and in particular to read the Greek New Testament. And in order to help us on our way, I thought it would be good for us to understand a little bit of where the Greeks have actually come from. So the idea of this video is to just give you a little bit of idea of what's happened in history to the Greek area, the Greek part of the Mediterranean in particular, and the wider world to some extent in general. Now, I'm not an expert on the history of this period, so I hope I don't give you any misinformation. I will try to tell you what we know, but I do apologise if I mislead you in anything. I shall try and keep to the point. I want to begin around the year 3000 BC. Well, that's not entirely true. I'm going to make a very brief comment kind of before then. But we're really going to focus a little bit more on 3000, around 3000. Around 10,000 BC, apparently, there was a warming of the climate. We had global warming. And that it brought to an end a small ice age, which had covered the whole of Europe, basically, and it opened up a huge area right up to the north of Europe for settlement, for settling the human population. So the human population could grow. The climate was much more conducive to life. So from about 10,000 onwards, the human population was growing. By the time we got to 3000, there were already a number of significant advances. Domestication and farming, cultivation of crops had allowed people to move from the hunter-gatherer type societies into settled societies, and cities were already becoming established. But 3000 seems to have been, around 3000 seems to have been a sort of pivotal point within the development of certain key cultures. And the three that we know well and people talk about are Egypt, Sumeria, and India. So you've got the Egyptian culture here in the just into Africa. And look, it's not covering a huge area. It does actually go a lot further south than that, but not a huge area. But this was well established by this period, and at this period was beginning to take off. We know Egypt from the pyramids, which weren't a lot after 3000. You then have this Sumerian culture. It was really, most of it was further south. It was the southern half of this purple area. Again, city-states, not like Egypt, which was a kind of a single monolithic whole, very much city-states. And then over to the eastern side, you had, it wasn't really India, it was the Indus Valley, but there was a civilization there that had reach right across into these European and African societies. So this was the world around 3000, and what happened in particular just after 3000 was the advent of writing. So writing was probably a defining moment within these societies, because it meant that information, that learnt experience could be passed on. But there was actually a fourth or even a fifth society, which people don't talk about so much. There was a society in Crete, probably a little bit later, around 2700 BC, known as the Minoans. Now, we know the Minoans, from our mythology, from our stories. Everyone hopefully knows the story of the Minotaur. You remember the Minotaur required human sacrifices, these women, girls who would be taken on a regular basis. And there was the story of the guy who decided he'd had enough of that, and he chased the Minotaur down and killed him so that this could stop. And he did that through the labyrinth. And so you have this tradition of the labyrinth. And they believe that they found the labyrinth in Crete. But certainly the Minoan civilization has been explored and discovered, and we find an incredible architecture in Minoa from around 2700 BC. But we also know that there was a culture widespread which we call the Cycladic culture, because it was first discovered in the Cyclades, these islands to the south of Greece. It has subsequently been discovered that the culture had settlements on mainland Greece as well. So it looks as if it was very widespread, and it could have been part and parcel of the Minoan culture as well. We don't know that much about it. We don't have any writing, but we do know that it was well established. So, if you like, Greece, from our point of view, starts in the Cyclades and with this Minoan culture. And Minoa, the Crete will come back as we look at the advance of Greece generally. So this was around 3000 BC, and even at this stage, things seem to be relatively settled. We don't get too much disruption. And so we go from 3000 into the 2000s. So from 3000 to 2000, not a lot seems to happen. And then around 2000, a little bit later, we find the growth of the Mycenaeans. Now, the millennium from 3000 to 2000, if you like, was the millennium of the Sumerians. It was the growth of writing, and the Sumerians were the dominant culture. Around 2000, the Semitic peoples had already entered into the whole of the Near East, and you had the Babylonians and the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians more south and the Assyrians further north, and they were beginning to make themselves felt. So by around 2000, you find that these Semitic cultures had begun to be established and taken over from the Sumerians. And the Sumerians really just disappeared from the scene. In the Mediterranean period, in the early part of this, so around 2000 to 1600, we see the growth of the Mycenaeans. The Minoans are still around. The Minoans are still building 3- and 4-story houses. They have beautiful architecture. Very peaceable people. And they thrive on buying and selling. They thrive on the movement of goods, and presumably because they were an island, they had a big kind of naval culture. The Mycenaeans, on the other hand, were quite warful, militaristic. They seem to have a fairly good relationship with the Minoans. I've read different things saying slightly different things about that. But certainly they dominated the Greek mainland and the other islands. They really came to their height around 1600 BC. They are best known for the fact that they conducted a war with Troy. They fought and conquered the Trojans. And we know all about that because of Greek literature. But what I haven't told you is that the Minoans, before the Mycenaeans come on the scene, had writing. But we have never been able to decode their writing. It's known as Linear A. Now, when the Mycenaeans came on the scene, they picked up the Minoans' writing, but they wrote their own language in it, so they created a thing which we call Linear B. Looks quite like Linear A. It uses the same script, but we have been able to decode Linear B. And amazingly, it is a sort of early form of Greek. So this is where Greek starts, and it looks as if the Mycenaeans brought Greek into the Greek mainland. So you've got a situation where we have the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. Now, the Minoans disappeared in the middle of the 14th century BC, and we don't really know why. A theory that's been well accepted was because it was the eruption of the volcano at Santorini. It was a major eruption, and it certainly was, equivalent to Krakatoa, and the belief was that it destroyed the Minoan civilization. But it didn't destroy Mycenaean civilization. It did seem to have an effect on other peoples. Now, other people more recently have said, no, that's a load of tosh, and it was really just part of the pressure that was coming from the north. All right, so what was that pressure? Well, now I've mentioned, in fact, I'll show you another map, which is a little bit later. We've mentioned the fact that there had been an ice age before around 10,000, and we had global warming, and that people settled throughout Europe. Now, for whatever reasons, people began migrating south again. Possibly there was a bit of cooling. More probably it was just that the population was growing. In the years 3000 to 2000, there seems to have been plenty of space. So probably the migration was already happening. People were moving in. But there was plenty of space for people to come in, live, and probably adopt the attitudes of the peoples around. But by around 1200, certainly, and possibly a lot earlier, the migration had become a flood, and there was a pressure on the civilizations of the time. And it's thought even as early as the 1450s or whenever it was, that this migration of people from the north had defeated the Minoans. And again, they would have been warring people. The Minoans were fairly peaceable, and they probably just couldn't preserve themselves against this influx of people. And we see this influx in a whole variety of places. We know quite a lot about the growth of the Hittites. They actually come into existence around 1700 BC, if I remember rightly. And they were a major civilization for a short period of time. We don't know much about them. We know of them being mentioned in the Bible, but we don't realise they were actually a big civilization. And they spoke a language that wasn't that different from Greek. In fact, we talk generally about this influx of people from the north as the sea peoples, because we know them through Egyptian and Near Eastern remains, stelae and documents, and they come in boats. In fact, we know about them in the Bible because there is a particular group of these sea peoples that feature quite prominently, and they're called the Philistines. So they were part of this movement from the north, settling wherever they could settle. They were a big problem for Egypt. They weakened Egypt enormously, which is actually one of the reasons why Israel could develop once they had managed to beat their own sea peoples. They were left relatively unimpacted by the civilizations around them, Egypt and Syria and Babylonia, because they were all fighting their own battles with this influx of people. So you had this constant influx of people, and that affected Greece as well. So you had this influx of people, probably was the reason why the Minoans disappeared, certainly was the reason why eventually the Mycenaeans also disappeared. They disappeared around 1200 BC. I have a pet theory. We know that the Mycenaeans fought Troy. It's almost the last thing they did, so I think it's possible that the Mycenaeans were exhausted by this battle with the Trojans. And although they won the war, it was a Pyrrhic victory and led to their extinction. So this is the map of around 1200 BC and this influx of people. The Minoans have disappeared, and now the Mycenaeans have disappeared, and it leads to a Dark Ages in Greece. But during this Dark Ages, there are three groups of people who move in from the north. This immigration continues, and this shows you kind of where they settled and who they were. The Dorians, the Ionians, and the Aeolians. And they're important because they left different dialects of Greek. And when people learn classical Greek, they have to learn the influence of these different dialects on the language. And you sometimes get these variations and irregularities in the language because although essentially what we learn is a form of Attic Greek, which was the Greek spoken in Athens, you would have influences from all these other dialects that would come in as well. So this is the influence during the Dark Ages, and the Dark Ages went from about 1200 to about 800 BC. So you have the ancient Greeks before 800 BC. The Mycenaeans have gone. The Greek peoples have now settled. They're largely illiterate. We don't have any writing from there, but Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey seems to preserve stories even from as long ago as 1200 BC and seems to preserve them fairly accurately. So there was a lot of oral tradition that grew over the period of time. There was also a guy called Hesiod who recorded more practical information. So it's quite possible that this very early Greek that comes from the Mycenaean period is still preserved in some of the traditions that were being passed down even to about 800 BC. But the form of writing that we have is considered to date from about 800 BC and onwards. And then, in fact, in the period from 800 to 500 BC, you have the beginnings, the green shoots of the classical period. It's not classical, so I've called it pre-classical. And in this period, what we do have is lots of these statues. They're all the same. They're all very stereotypical. The women are always in these long flowing white robes, and they're known as chore. And the men are always naked and very proud of themselves, and they are known as kouros. One of the key things about these statues, which is worth mentioning, someone pointed out to me, is that they're smiling. And they all have a smile. This was a settled age, a comfortable age, an age when the Greek peoples were finally settling. They were militaristic. They were city-states. So you had Athens, you had Sparta, you had Thebes, you had other cities, and they were all very fiercely independent. But it still seemed to be a relatively peaceable and happy time. Until we come to the classical period. And the classical period, the smile stops. That's not just a trivial comment. On all the artwork, we have amazing artwork, much more artwork. But it is true that a serious note is injected into all the artwork. This is Zeus, and he's about to throw his thunderbolt, and he's not happy. And the reason why they have lost their smile is that the thing that defines the classical period is their war with Persia. They are under siege. It was an amazingly creative period. It was creative politically, it was creative socially, and it was creative in terms of literature and philosophy. And I just put a list of a few people down there, but could have extended the list enormously. You've got philosophers like Demosthenes and Isocrates. They were more political spin doctors. You have playwrights like Sophocles and Aeschylus, who were both poets and playwrights. So this is the classical period. This is where Greek writing came of age. And this is where the Greek grammar and the Greek structure became formed. But all that came to a head in the 4th century BC. Persia was still the dominant force. Greece was struggling. It was struggling to keep Persia at bay, and it was struggling with internal squabbles and war fighting. And there was a Greek patriot to the north called Philip. And Philip loved Greece and Greek culture and wanted to unite the Greek peoples against the Persian Empire, which he did, but at a cost. And the cost really was a political one. The independence of the people of Greece, in a sense, went by the way. So Greece, as I've said, was a sort of collection or loose collection of city-states. Macedonia, which was the kingdom of Philip, was a kingdom, ruled as a kingdom. And he formed a power base that united everyone and led to the defeat of Persia. Now, Philip you may or may not know about, but his son you will know, because his son was Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great, in his short life, 33 years, conquered a huge empire. So he united Greece, he defeated the Persians, he conquered the whole of the area right up to India. And he conquered Egypt as well. Now, his stated aim was to bring Greek culture to the world. He as did his father. They believed that Greece had something unique, something special, and they wanted to bring it to the world. And that's what he did. And he did it in spades. But again, it was the Greek culture as mediated by Macedonia. And it was no longer really called Greek, it was called Hellenism. So from now on, we refer to Hellenism and the Hellenic culture. And not only was the culture a slightly modified form of Greek, but so was the language. And so the language is called Koine Greek. And it was Koine Greek that they disseminated throughout the Eastern world. When Alexander died, as I said, he died quite young at 33. His empire was carved up by his 4 generals. One essentially took over Greece and Macedonia itself, the origins. Another took Thrace. Another took the whole of what was Persia, and another took what was Egypt and became Egypt still. Now, the first two, the Greek and the Thrace, really didn't make a big impact on things. A guy that took over Persia and the East was a guy called Seleucus, I think his name was, but it became the Seleucids, the empire that ran the place there. And the guys that took over in Egypt were the Ptolemies. And we don't really know much about the Seleucids, which is a shame because they were a big force and they had a big impact on Israel between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in fact had quite a big influence on apocalyptic literature because they were pretty apocalyptic. One of the things they tried to do because of Greek culture and the Greek gods was that they didn't like the Jewish practice of believing in one God. So they tried to destroy that, and they tried to get the Jews to worship the gods of Greece. They wanted everyone to worship the gods of Greece. And that didn't go down very well. And of course it was the last of the Ptolemies that played the important part with the Roman civilization between Caesar and Cleopatra, and then Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So here we have the Koine Greek, the spread of the Koine Greek, including the area of Palestine. And this explains also why so much of the New Testament was written in Greek, because obviously even though these were Jews, if they wanted to communicate throughout the world, then they would use Greek. So Greek really formed the function that Latin did a little bit later, and that English forms today. It's the lingua franca of the day. Now, if we move on, of course, the Romans took over. But you can see they lost quite a lot of the eastern part of Alexander's kingdom, but on the whole kept the Mediterranean part, if you like, along with the places that we identify and think of as part of Rome. But, this was all Roman territory as well. But it remained Greek-speaking. And so Greek was highly valued by the Romans. Romans considered that anyone who had a good education should be able to speak Greek as well as Latin. And so Greek was highly valued. So that was where the Greek has come from. That's the Greek that we're looking at. So in a sense, this map that we're looking at now is pretty much what it looked like at the time the New Testament was being written. Now you will see this little town of Alexandria here. This was a centre of learning. And in fact, 200 years beforehand, before the Romans had come, when it was still Ptolemaic, there had been a group of Jewish scholars who translated the Old Testament into Greek. And that's the Septuagint. And that's quite an important piece of work in Greek as well. And in learning to read the New Testament in Greek, it's not that difficult to read the Old Testament as well. That too was in a form of Koine Greek. Interesting enough, scholars now have a lot of information on Koine Greek because they've managed to uncover a number of rubbish dumps. And it's the language that people wrote their letters in, and we have lots of casual correspondence and other documents that show us just what the language really was like. So that's our rapid tour of Greek, but we haven't quite finished because it is worth just looking at what happened to Greek afterwards. Because the Roman Empire, as you possibly know, came under threat around in the 5th century AD. The Germanic tribes started to make inroads into the Roman Empire, and we learned that the Roman Empire was destroyed around 400 and whatever. Well, it wasn't. We were left with the eastern half, and the eastern half survived. And the eastern half survived until the 1450s. And it was called the Byzantine Empire. Now, this map is actually formed from around 1180, I think it is. And by this time, this Byzantine Empire has shrunk quite a bit. But it preserved an awful lot of traditions and culture and the church. And it was a Christian, quote unquote Christian, empire. So it's here that the Greek Orthodox Church took root. Now, by the time of this map, you can see this kingdom of Sicily over here, which was actually a Norman thing, and then, in fact, a little bit later became a whole variety of other things. But you will also notice that there's this huge number of Islamic states that have grown up. And the Byzantine Empire now was under pressure from these various Islamic states who were themselves looking to expand. And in fact, in the 1450s, the Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottoman Turks. And ironically, when the Byzantine Empire fell, they, quite understandably, a lot of scholars and other people fled to Europe for refuge, because Europe was a Christian society. And they took with them their treasures, which would have included artwork, but also they took with them their language. Now, up until then in Europe, we by and large ignored Greek, and pretty much everything we knew was in Latin. So this actually led to an explosion of learning of Greek, discovering classical Greek authors, discovering Plato, discovering some of the classical writings, but also discovering the Greek New Testament. And because this flood of Greek literature came into Europe, we had one or two people like Erasmus initially, and then like Luther, who began reading the Bible in Greek, and it led to the Reformation. So what's interesting is, because the Muslims conquered Byzantium, the Reformation could happen. Isn't it interesting how God works through what looks like total disaster, and yet he brought life through that experience. So that's the story of Greek, even up to the 15th century. And obviously we've been discovering more and more about Greek through more academic work, and we've discovered that there's even more to the story, but that perhaps is for another video another time.